The snow didn't fall that morning. It came sideways, fast, white, and absolute. In less than 2 hours, the temperature across the Nebraska plains dropped nearly 40 degrees. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Cattle froze, standing up. A schoolteacher in a neighboring county, barely a mile from her own door, lost her way and never came back. That day, January 12, 1888, would be remembered for generations. Every structure that stood above the ground took the storm like a fist to the face. Wooden frames cracked. Sod walls buckled under the weight of drifting snow. By midnight, the thermometers inside most homestead cabins were reading the same temperatures as outside. Families huddled under everything they owned, burning furniture when the woodpile ran out. But on one low, dark hillside, barely noticeable, easy to mistake for just another roll of frozen earth, a thin thread of smoke rose straight up into the white sky. Inside, it was 51 degrees. No panic, no frozen pipes, no furniture burning. The man who built that structure had been mocked for 2 years. Neighbors called it embarrassing. A few called it dangerous. One local record describes a visiting land agent who refused to even walk onto the property, saying the whole thing would collapse by spring. It didn't collapse by spring. It was still standing 40 years later. What he understood, and what almost no one else on those plains had figured out, wasn't about building stronger. It wasn't about burning more wood. It was about something hidden, something the earth itself was offering for free, if you were willing to stop building upward and start thinking downward. This is the story of how one man buried his home beneath the prairie, and how that decision turned out to be one of the most precise pieces of thermal engineering the frontier ever produced. If you've ever wondered what the old-timers really knew about surviving brutal winters with almost nothing, stay with us. And while you're here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Whether you're dealing with your own brutal winters or just fascinated by the ingenuity of people who had no margin for error, we want to hear from you. Because this story goes much deeper than you'd expect. Literally. To understand why one man chose to bury his home beneath the earth, you first have to understand what the Great Plains did to structures that dare to stand above it. The American prairie in the 1870s and 1880s was not the romantic, golden landscape that painters like to imagine. It was a vast, almost featureless expanse of grass and wind, beautiful in summer and methodically lethal in winter. There were no mountain ridges to break the Arctic air pouring down from Canada. No dense forest belts to slow the gusts. Nothing between a homesteader's front door and the North Pole but open, flat, frozen ground stretching for hundreds of miles. The wind was the first problem. Not the cold, the wind. A temperature of 10 degrees Fahrenheit in calm air is survivable with proper clothing and a modest fire. That same 10 degrees Fahrenheit with a 40-mile-per-hour wind across open prairie produces a wind chill that could disable an exposed person in under 20 minutes. Early settlers learned this distinction the hard way, and many of them didn't get a second chance to apply the lesson. The second problem was the absence of timber. The forests that Eastern settlers had relied on for centuries, the oak, the pine, the hemlock that built New England and Appalachia, simply did not exist on the Central Plains. Homesteaders arriving in Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakota Territory in the 1870s found a landscape almost entirely bare of trees. The few that grew did so along creek beds and river corridors, and they were harvested quickly. Lumber had to be shipped by rail from the east or from the upper Midwest at prices that most homesteaders couldn't reliably afford. So settlers built with what they had. And what they had, in most cases, was sod. The sod house, the sod die, became the defining structure of Great Plains homesteading. Builders cut thick blocks of prairie turf, roots and all, and stacked them like bricks into walls 18 to 24 inches thick. The results were, in many ways, surprisingly functional. Sod walls had genuine thermal mass. They absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it gradually at night. In mild winters, a sod die with a decent stove could be reasonably comfortable. But sod had limits that became catastrophic in extreme conditions. When blizzard-level snow accumulated on a sod roof, sometimes 3 to 4 feet of wet packed drifts, the structure could simply give way. Moisture was the enemy of sod construction. A week of alternating freeze and thaw could reduce the best-built sod-dye walls to soft, crumbling earth. Roof leaks were so common, they were considered a standard feature, not a flaw. Local accounts from the 1870s describe families waking after storms to find interior walls collapsed inward, livestock frozen in their stalls, and food stores ruined by water infiltration. Wooden frame cabins, meanwhile, offered even less protection. A standard one-room frame cabin of the period, walls of 1-inch boards with minimal insulation, provided almost no buffer against extreme cold. In a serious blizzard, interior temperatures could track outdoor temperatures within 8 to 10 degrees. Settlers burned wood at a rate that even a well-stocked woodpile couldn't sustain across a long, violent winter. And on the treeless plains, wood was not something most families could afford to burn carelessly. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the standard building strategies imported from the East were fundamentally mismatched with the environment they were being dropped into. The East had forests and mountains. The plains had wind, grass, and earth. Building above the ground, with thin walls and pitched roofs, was a strategy evolved for a completely different set of conditions. On the open prairie, it was not just inefficient. Under the right circumstances, it was fatal. What the land offered instead was something most settlers refused to consider: depth. Stillness. The constant, quiet temperature of the earth itself, just a few feet below the surface. A resource sitting directly beneath every homestead claim, ignored by almost everyone who filed for one. Almost everyone. His name, as best as local records allow us to reconstruct, was Edvard Brandt, a Norwegian-born settler who arrived in Custer County, Nebraska, in the late 1870s with his wife, 2 children, and a level of practical stubbornness that his neighbors would spend years misinterpreting as eccentricity. Brandt had come from the western fjord country of Norway, where winter was not a season, but a condition of life. He had grown up watching older men build into hillsides, not out of poverty, but out of hard-won knowledge that the earth was a partner, not just a platform. In Norway, partially buried storage structures called stabber had kept food and supplies through winters that would have shocked even the most seasoned plain settler. The principle was old, practical, and completely absent from the vocabulary of American frontier construction. When Brandt filed his homestead claim and began assessing his 160 acres of flat Nebraska grass, he asked a different question than most of his neighbors. While they were calculating how much lumber they'd need to import, Brandt was walking the land, pressing his boot heel into the soil, reading the slight rise of a natural earthen berm along the northwest edge of his claim. He wasn't looking for a place to build a house. He was looking for a place to build into. The decision was not made lightly. Oral accounts passed down through the Brandt family, later recorded by a county historical society in the early 1930s, describe Edvard spending an entire week digging test holes across the property before selecting his site. He was measuring something his neighbors didn't think to measure: the temperature of the earth at different depths. Using a simple iron rod in his hand, he found that at roughly 4 to 5 feet below the surface, the soil temperature remained relatively stable regardless of what the air above it was doing. Even in late October, as the surface ground began to harden with frost, the earth a few feet down held a quiet, constant warmth, somewhere around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, as best as period descriptions allow us to estimate. That number mattered. It meant that any structure embedded at that depth would start every cold night with a thermal advantage that no surface-built cabin could match. Instead of fighting to hold heat against a 10 degrees Fahrenheit exterior, a buried structure would only need to bridge the gap between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and comfortable living temperature. The stove didn't need to be large. The woodpile didn't need to be enormous. The walls didn't need to be 6 feet thick. The earth itself would carry most of the load. Brandt broke ground in the summer of 1879. He dug into the side of the berm at a precise angle, not straight down, which would have created drainage problems, but horizontally into the slope with a slight upward pitch toward the back wall to allow cold air to sink toward the entrance and warm air to stratify toward the living space. He cut the hillside back about 14 feet, excavated a rectangular space roughly 16 feet wide and 22 feet deep, and began lining the walls with a combination of cut sod blocks and flat fieldstone gathered from a dry creek bed a quarter-mile away. The entrance faced southeast. This was not an accident. A southeast-facing entrance captured the low winter sun during the warmest part of the day while keeping the dominant northwest winds, the direction from which the most violent prairie storms arrived, from driving directly into the opening. The door itself was set back 3 feet into a short earthen vestibule, a buffer zone that prevented the full blast of outside air from entering the main space whenever someone opened it. Neighbors who visited during construction remembered the scene with a mixture of puzzlement and condescension. One account, recorded decades later by a local newspaper retrospective, quotes a fellow homesteader as saying he thought Brandt was digging himself a grave rather than a home. Another reportedly offered to loan him lumber, suggesting the Norwegian was simply too poor to build properly. Brandt, by all accounts, declined politely and kept digging. He moved his family in before the first snow of the winter of 1879. Before we go any further, it's worth stopping to correct a persistent misunderstanding, because when most people hear the word dugout, they picture something closer to a shallow hole in the ground. Dark, damp, barely habitable, the desperate last resort of someone who had run out of options. That image is almost entirely wrong. And it was wrong in Edvard Brandt's time, too. A properly engineered dugout was not a cave. It was not a root cellar with a door on it. It was a calculated structural system that used the thermal properties of the earth as its primary building material. In the right hands, it could outperform nearly every other type of frontier construction in terms of warmth, stability, and material efficiency. The key distinction begins with the walls. Brandt's dugout, like the best examples of the form across the Great Plains, was not simply carved from raw earth and left to crumble. The interior walls were faced with a double layer of cut sod blocks, each block roughly 12 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 4 inches thick, stacked tight and pressed against the earthen cut. Behind those sod blocks, the native soil provided an effectively infinite reservoir of thermal mass. The sod layer acted as both a structural liner and a vapor barrier, slowing the transfer of moisture from the surrounding ground into the living space. The floor was one of the most important engineering decisions in the entire structure, and one of the least discussed. Brandt did not simply leave the excavated earth as a floor. He tamped it down in successive layers, mixing in a small amount of ash from a burn pile, a technique that local oral records suggest was known among several immigrant communities on the plains. The ash served two purposes. It helped stabilize the compacted earth surface, reducing the tendency to turn muddy under foot traffic, and it created a slightly more reflective base that helped bounce radiant heat back upward into the living space rather than absorbing it into the ground. The roof was the structure's single greatest engineering challenge, and the point where most poorly built dugouts failed. A weak roof meant collapse under snow load, potentially 200 to 400 pounds per square foot during a serious blizzard. Brandt's solution was a series of hand-hewn timber beams, cottonwood, sourced from a creek bottom several miles away, laid across the width of the space at roughly 30-inch intervals. Over the beams, he laid smaller poles, then a thick mat of dry prairie grass, then a minimum of 18 inches of packed sod on top. The total roof assembly weighed somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 pounds. It was heavy. It was also nearly impervious to wind, cold, and snow load. This is where the physics become remarkable. That 18-inch sod roof, combined with the earthen hillside above it, created an insulating layer with a thermal resistance that no single-layer wooden roof of the era could approach. While a typical frame cabin roof might allow 60 to 70% of interior heat to escape upward over the course of a cold night, the sod and earth roof of a well-built dugout reduced that loss dramatically, by some estimates, to less than 20% under equivalent conditions. The stove was deliberately small. A cast-iron box stove, roughly 18 inches wide and 24 inches long, sat near the rear wall, the warmest point in the structure, farthest from the entrance. Its flue pipe ran upward through the roof at an angle, exiting several feet back from the entrance to prevent downdrafts. Because the earth was already doing most of the insulating work, the stove didn't need to produce enormous amounts of heat. It needed to produce consistent, sustained heat, and in a space that was already starting each night at 50 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Even a modest fire was enough to raise the interior to a comfortable 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit within an hour or two. The total firewood consumption for a dugout of this type, through an average Nebraska winter, ran to roughly one-third of what a comparable frame cabin required. On the fuel-scarce plains, where many families burned dried buffalo chips as their primary fuel source, that difference was not a convenience. It was the difference between having enough to last until March and running out in February. None of this was magic. All of it was physics, and all of it was invisible from the outside, which is precisely why, when the neighbors walked past that low, unremarkable mound of earth with its thin thread of chimney smoke, they saw nothing worth learning from. They would change their minds. But first, the winter of 1888 would have to arrive. There is a temperature that exists beneath every field, every yard, every stretch of open prairie on the North American continent. It doesn't change much with the seasons. It doesn't respond to blizzards or heat waves. It simply sits there quiet and constant, a few feet below the surface. And for most of human history, the people who understood how to use it lived warmer, safer, and more efficiently than those who didn't. That temperature, across most of the central United States, hovers somewhere between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, depending on latitude and local soil composition. Geologists call it the ground temperature equilibrium zone, the depth at which the Earth's surface temperature fluctuations stop penetrating. In Nebraska, that zone begins at roughly 4 to 6 feet below grade. Below that line, the soil is indifferent to winter. It simply holds. Edvard Brandt didn't have a geology textbook. He had something more reliable: the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of Northern European builders who had been working with earth shelter construction for centuries. In the fjord regions of Norway, the relationship between buried structure and stable ground temperature was not a theory. It was a lived reality, encoded in the way barns were built into hillsides, the way root houses were dug into sloping ground, the way even some dwelling spaces were partially submerged to take advantage of the Earth's quiet insulating presence. What Brandt understood, and what most of his Nebraska neighbors did not, was that thermal mass is not the same thing as insulation. The distinction matters enormously, and it explains why so many well-intentioned frontier builders got their calculations wrong. Insulation resists heat flow. A thick wooden wall, a layer of straw, a wool blanket, these materials slow the movement of heat from one side to the other. They are passive resistors. They don't store energy, they delay its loss. And in extreme cold, delay is not enough. A sufficiently long, sufficiently cold night will eventually drain heat through even a well-insulated surface wall if there is no thermal reservoir to replenish it. Thermal mass, by contrast, stores heat energy and releases it slowly over time. Stone, earth, clay, and water are all high-mass materials. They absorb heat during warm periods and give it back during cold ones, acting as a natural buffer against temperature swings. The critical insight, the one that makes earth-sheltered construction so different from any above-ground technique, is that the thermal mass of the surrounding soil is essentially unlimited. A dugout embedded in 4 feet of earth is not borrowing heat from a finite reservoir. It is coupled to a thermal system of incomprehensible size, one that will never be depleted by a single winter or a single decade of winters. For Brandt's dugout, this meant something very specific. Every night, as the air temperature above the plains dropped toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below, the surrounding earth continued to push gentle, consistent warmth inward through the sod-lined walls. The soil didn't heat the interior aggressively. It didn't need to. It simply prevented the cold from winning. The interior temperature of the dugout, even without a fire burning, would naturally stabilize somewhere around 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, above freezing, above the danger threshold, above the point where food stores would be damaged or water barrels would ice over. This baseline temperature transformed the entire logic of heating. A conventional frame cabin in the same conditions might start a winter night at 65 degrees Fahrenheit with a roaring fire, then spend the next 12 hours in a losing battle against the cold, its walls shedding heat in every direction as the outdoor temperature plummeted. By morning, if the fire went out, the interior could be at 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Every British thermal unit the stove produced was fighting a rearguard action against physics. In the dugout, the stove was not fighting. It was supplementing. The earth had already done the heavy work of keeping the interior above the critical threshold. The small cast-iron box stove needed only to raise the temperature from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to a comfortable 65 or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A lift of roughly 15 to 18 degrees rather than the 50 to 60 degrees a surface cabin required. Burn times were shorter. Fuel consumption dropped. The fire could be banked low overnight, and the interior would still be livable by morning, something that was simply not possible in a frame or even a well-built sod die without a continuous burn. Local accounts from settlers who visited the Brandt homestead during its early winters consistently note the same surprise. Walking into the dugout after crossing the frozen prairie felt like stepping into a different world. Not dramatically warm, not stuffy or smoky, just stable, settled, as if the temperature had made a decision and refused to be argued out of it. That stability was not comfort by accident. It was the earth itself, doing what it had always done, for anyone patient enough to ask it. Most people think of winter cold as a single force, temperature measured in degrees, read from a thermometer nailed to the porch post. But experienced frontier settlers knew that temperature alone was almost never what killed you. What killed you was movement. The movement of air across exposed skin, across poorly sealed walls, through gaps in roofing, around loose door frames. Cold air in motion is a fundamentally different threat than cold air at rest. And it was this distinction that gave the buried dugout its second and perhaps most decisive advantage. The physics involved are not complicated, but they are often underestimated. When wind moves across a surface, whether that surface is human skin or a wooden wall, it continuously strips away the thin layer of warmer air that would otherwise act as a natural insulating buffer. This is convective heat loss, and it operates on a multiplying scale. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit with no wind, a building loses heat through its walls at a rate determined by the temperature difference between inside and outside. At a 30-mile-per-hour wind to those same conditions, and the effective rate of heat loss through an unprotected surface wall can increase by 40 to 60%. The wind is not making the air colder in any absolute sense. It is making it vastly more aggressive at extracting heat from anything it touches. On the open Nebraska plains in winter, wind was not an occasional hazard. It was a constant. Settlers who kept weather journals from the 1870s and 1880s describe sustained winds of 20 to 35 miles per hour as routine winter conditions, with frequent gusts well above that. During blizzard events, wind speeds of 45 to 60 miles per hour were recorded at several plains weather stations established in the 1870s. These are not storms. They were the baseline operating environment of the prairie in winter. Every above-ground structure had to contend with this wind directly. Sod walls, for all their thermal mass, had surface exposure. Every exterior face of a sod die was in contact with moving air, and moving air meant accelerated heat extraction. Frame cabins were even more vulnerable. Their thinner walls offered less mass and less resistance, and their wooden construction made truly airtight sealing nearly impossible with the tools and materials available to most homesteaders. The dugout faced none of this. This is the part of the engineering that is easy to overlook, because it requires thinking about what isn't there rather than what is. A dugout embedded in a hillside has, by definition, almost no exposed exterior surface. Brandt's structure, as best as historical descriptions allow us to reconstruct, had a single exposed face, the southeast-facing entrance wall, roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, constructed of double-stacked sod with a heavy wooden door frame. Everything else, every other wall, the entire ceiling, the floor, was in direct contact with the earth. There was no north wall for the Arctic wind to hammer. There was no west wall for the afternoon gusts to strip. There was no roof surface for the blizzard to load with drifting snow until something gave way. The wind that howled across the plains at 50 miles per hour on a January night simply had nowhere to go. It passed over the dugout's earthen roof without finding purchase. It pushed against that small southeast face without the leverage to do meaningful damage. And because the dominant storm winds came from the northwest, the direction from which Brandt's earth berm provided complete coverage, even the entrance was partially sheltered by the natural curve of the hillside. Inside, the effect was immediately perceptible. No drafts, no rattling walls, no sound of wind at all. In most conditions, just the occasional distant moan as gusts moved across the chimney opening above. The air was still, and still air at 50 degrees Fahrenheit feels dramatically warmer than moving air at the same temperature. Settlers who visited described it as uncanny, the sensation of the noise and violence of the prairie simply stopping the moment you stepped inside. There was one additional convective advantage that Brandt had engineered deliberately, though his neighbors wouldn't have recognized it as engineering at all: the sunken entrance vestibule. That 3-foot deep recessed entryway before the main door served as a cold trap. When the exterior door was opened, the cold air that rushed in was denser than the warm interior air and naturally sank to the floor of the vestibule rather than rolling into the main living space. It was a rudimentary airlock, a technique known to builders of ice houses and cold cellars for centuries, applied here to a dwelling with quiet precision. The total effect of eliminating convective heat loss, combined with the thermal mass advantage described previously, meant that the Brandt dugout was operating in a fundamentally different thermal universe than any above-ground structure on the surrounding prairie. Where neighbors were fighting wind, drafts, and continuous heat extraction through every exposed surface, Brandt's home was simply still. The earth held it. The earth quieted it. And in that quiet, a small fire was more than enough. Visitors to the Brandt homestead in the winter months often noted, with some confusion, how small the stove was. For a family of 4 living through a Nebraska winter, the cast-iron box stove at the back of the dugout would have seemed almost comically inadequate to anyone accustomed to the heating demands of a conventional frontier cabin. It was not a large Russian-style masonry heater. It was not a wide, stone-backed fireplace. It was a modest, utilitarian box, roughly 18 inches wide, 24 inches long, and 14 inches tall. Sitting on a flat stone base near the rear wall, its single flue pipe angling upward through the earthen ceiling at roughly 70 degrees. And yet, by every account that survives, it kept the family warm. Consistently, through multiple winters, without the kind of desperate, continuous burning that exhausted the fuel supplies of so many neighboring homesteads by mid-February. Understanding why requires revisiting the thermal logic of the space it was operating in. A conventional one-room frame cabin of the period, roughly 16 by 20 feet, with thin board walls and a minimal roof, presented the stove with an almost impossible task. The interior volume of air was perhaps 2,500 cubic feet, but that volume was constantly losing heat through every surface simultaneously, through the walls at a rate driven by the temperature differential and wind exposure, through the roof where warm air naturally stratified and conducted directly into the cold night sky, through gaps in the floorboards where cold ground air infiltrated, through the door frame where the fit was never truly airtight. Maintaining 65 degrees Fahrenheit in such a space against a 5 degrees Fahrenheit exterior required a stove operating near its capacity, burning 6 to 8 hours of fuel to carry a family through a single night. Now consider the dugout. Interior volume roughly comparable, perhaps 2,800 cubic feet for Brandt 16 by 22 foot space. But the heat loss profile was transformed beyond recognition. The floor, packed earth treated with ash, conducted heat downward at a fraction of the rate a wooden floor over an air gap. The walls, embedded in earth, had essentially no wind exposure. Convective stripping at the surface was eliminated. The ceiling, under 18 inches of sod and several feet of earthen hillside, lost heat upward so slowly that the difference between day and night interior ceiling temperature was reportedly only a few degrees. and the earth itself, pressing in from all sides at a stable 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, was continuously contributing a low, steady thermal input that required no wood to produce. In this environment, the stove's job description changed completely. It was no longer trying to maintain a target temperature against continuous aggressive heat loss. It was nudging an already stable space upward from its natural earth temperature equilibrium to comfortable living range. The math was radically different. Oral accounts recorded by the Custer County Historical Society describe Brandt burning what neighbors estimated at roughly one-third the firewood, or in drier months, one-third the dried buffalo chips, of a comparable household in a frame or sawdye structure. On a prairie where fuel was scarce enough that some families sent children out in dangerous cold to gather chips from the frozen ground, that ratio was not a minor efficiency gain. It was the difference between a family that made it to spring with reserves to spare and one that was burning their furniture by March. The stove's placement at the rear wall was also deliberate. In a partially buried space, the warmest zone is naturally the deepest, farthest from the cooler entrance, surrounded on three sides by earth, with a rising column of warm air from the stove stratifying horizontally across the ceiling and radiating downward through the living space before slowly migrating toward the cooler entrance zone. By positioning the stove at the back, Brandt was using the natural convective circulation of the space to distribute heat without any mechanical assistance. The warm air moved. The family moved through warm air. The entrance stayed cooler, acting as a natural buffer. The flue angle mattered too. A near-vertical flue pipe in a conventional above-ground structure creates strong draft, useful for a large fire that needs aggressive combustion air. Brandt's angled flue, passing through a significant depth of insulating earth before reaching the exterior, stayed warmer along its length, reducing the tendency toward cold backdrafts that plagued above-ground stoves in high wind conditions. A sudden gust across the chimney top that would have blown smoke back into a frame cabin simply didn't have the leverage to reverse a flue that was partially embedded and partially sheltered by the earthen berm above. The result was a heating system that rewarded patience and precision over brute force. A small, steady fire, a space that wanted to stay warm, and an earth that was quietly and without any drama doing most of the work. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most thermally efficient domestic heating arrangements on the Central Plains in the 1870s and 1880s. Nobody called it that at the time, of course. At the time, the neighbors were still calling it a hole in the ground. There is a particular kind of social pressure that operates in isolated frontier communities, quieter than outright hostility, but more persistent. It is the pressure of visibility, of being seen doing something that doesn't look like what everyone else is doing. On the Nebraska plains in the late 1870s, where homestead claims were scattered across the flat expanse like islands in a grass sea, what your neighbors thought of your choices mattered in ways that went beyond mere opinion. Community relationships were practical infrastructure. The man who laughed at your dugout in October might be the same man you needed to borrow a horse from in April. Edvard Brandt felt that pressure from the moment he broke ground. The criticism came in several forms. Some of it was aesthetic. The dugout simply didn't look like a home. It looked like a disturbed patch of hillside with a door stuck in it. There was no visible structure to admire, no evidence of the effort and investment that a proper frame cabin or a well-laid sawdye communicated to passing eyes. On a frontier where the ability to build above the ground was associated with resource, competence, and respectability, disappearing into the earth read as failure, even if the person doing the disappearing had made a more sophisticated engineering calculation than anyone giving them grief. Some of the criticism was practical, or at least dressed itself as such. Neighbors argued that the dugout would flood in spring, a legitimate concern for poorly sited earthen structures, though Brandt's drainage design on the slope berm addressed it directly. Others predicted that the roof would collapse under heavy snow, that the interior would be too dark for daily life, that moisture and mold would make the space uninhabitable within a season or two. A merchant in the nearest town reportedly told a customer that the Norwegian farmer up on the county road had gone to ground like a badger and would likely fare about as well. The comparison to animals was not accidental. It carried a specific social weight in frontier culture, with a distance between a civilized settler and the wilderness was something many homesteaders worked actively to maintain in their self-presentation. Living in the earth, in the minds of many who hadn't tried it, placed you on the wrong side of that line. Local oral record from the period described the dugout being referred to variously as a badger hole, an armadillo house, and, with particular creative flair from one recorded account, the Norwegians' improvement on the grave. Brandt, by all reconstructed accounts, responded to this with a quality that would have infuriated his critics even more had they recognized it for what it was: complete indifference. He did not argue. He did not invite inspections. He did not attempt to explain the thermal logic of his construction to people who had already decided it was foolish. He finished the entrance vestibule, hung a heavy wool curtain behind the wooden door as a secondary draft barrier, stacked his fuel supply against the interior rear wall where it would stay dry, and began the quiet business of living through his first Nebraska winter in a structure that his neighbors were certain would either kill him or humiliate him before spring. The first winter passed without incident. The interior, by Brandt's own account as recorded by the County Historical Society, never dropped below 47 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the coldest stretches of January and February, periods when several neighboring families reported interior temperatures in their frame cabins hovering near 20 degrees Fahrenheit despite burning fuel continuously. The Brandt family's food stores, kept in a small side alcove dug into the rear wall of the dugout, remained at stable temperatures throughout the winter. Nothing froze. Nothing spoiled from cold. The second winter was similar. And the third. By the winter of 1882 or 1883, the mockery had begun to shift, not into admiration, not yet, but into something more complicated. A few neighbors began asking questions that they framed carefully, as if they were merely curious and not, in fact, reconsidering everything they had built. How was the drainage holding up? Had there been any roof trouble? How much wood was getting through the winter? Brandt answered honestly and without drama. The drainage was fine. The roof had not moved. The wood lasted until mid-March with supply to spare. The questions didn't become urgent until January of 1888. By then, it was too late for most of them to do anything but watch. It began as a mild morning. That is the detail that made January 12th, 1888 so catastrophic. Not the storm itself, but the deception that preceded it. Across the Central Plains that Thursday morning, temperatures were unusually mild for mid-January. In some areas of Nebraska and Dakota Territory, the thermometer read above freezing at sunrise. Children left for school without heavy coats. Farmers went out to their fields without the full layering of cold weather gear they would have worn a week earlier. The air was still. The sky was pale but clear. The storm front that arrived before noon moved faster than anything the plains weather observers of the period had documented. It came from the northwest, as the killing storms always did, but its speed and the sharpness of its temperature drop were outside the range of experience for most of the settlers in its path. In some locations, the temperature fell 40 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 4 hours. In others, the drop was faster. The wind went from calm to 45 miles per hour in what witnesses described as minutes. Snow, fine, dry, crystalline, driven nearly horizontal by the wind, reduced visibility to a matter of feet. People who were caught outside when the front arrived had very little time to react and very little margin for error. The storm would later be called the school children's blizzard because of the particular horror of what happened to children and teachers who were in rural schoolhouses when it hit. Small, thin-walled wooden structures often a mile or more from the nearest homestead, suddenly engulfed in whiteout conditions with no reliable way to navigate home. Historical records document hundreds of deaths across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Minnesota directly attributable to that single afternoon and night. The final toll, across all affected areas, is estimated at somewhere between 235 and 500 lives. The structural damage to homestead buildings was extensive and, in many cases, total. Frame cabins that had stood for years buckled under the combination of wind load and snow accumulation. Sod structures that had seemed solid enough through previous winters absorbed days of driven snow and wet freeze-thaw cycles in the storm's aftermath, emerging damaged or partially collapsed. Livestock shelters failed in large numbers. The animals inside them, cattle, horses, hogs, froze where they stood. On the Brandt homestead, the storm arrived in the early afternoon. Edvard Brandt was inside the dugout when the light changed. He had been splitting kindling near the entrance vestibule, a winter morning task, when the wind, which had been absent all morning, suddenly announced itself against the small exterior wall with a sound he later described, in an account recorded by a relative, as like a train finding the wrong track. Within minutes, the temperature outside was dropping fast enough to be perceptible through the wooden door frame. He pulled it shut, dropped the interior latch, drew the wool curtain across the entry, and added wood to the stove. Then he waited. The storm that raged above him for the next 18 hours left almost no mark on the interior of the dugout. The earth absorbed the wind's violence completely. The earthen berm above the roof took the full weight of drifting snow. Estimates suggest 3 to 4 feet of packed drift accumulated over the dugout's roof line during the storm, without any structural distress. The small cast-iron stove, burning at a moderate rate, maintained the interior at a steady 62 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the night. The stovepipe, partially buried in earth along its run and opening above a sheltered section of the berm, drew cleanly without backdraft despite the sustained high winds above. In the morning, Brandt pushed open his door against the resistance of snow that had drifted against the entrance face, the only exterior surface his structure presented to the storm, cleared it with a wooden shovel kept inside for exactly that purpose, and stepped out into a landscape that had been fundamentally rearranged overnight. The prairie around him was unrecognizable. Drifts had buried fence lines and outbuildings. 2 of his neighbors' frame cabins, visible from the ridge above the dugout entrance, had lost sections of roof. A third structure, a newer sod dye belonging to a family that had arrived the previous summer, had collapsed entirely under the snow load, though the family, fortunately, had made it to a neighbor's home before the worst of the storm hit. Brandt's dugout was intact. The roof had not moved. The walls had not shifted. The interior temperature, after the stove had burned low overnight, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that the water barrel near the entrance wall showed no ice at all. He stood at the entrance to his hillside for a long moment, looking at the damage across the prairie. Then he went back inside, stoked the fire, and put water on for coffee. Numbers are rarely dramatic, but in the winter of 1888, on the Nebraska plains, a few specific numbers carried the weight of life and death, and the contrast between what those numbers said inside the Brandt dugout and what they said inside the structures around it amounted to one of the most precise real-world validations of vernacular engineering the frontier would ever produce. Let's be careful here, as the historical record requires. No laboratory thermographs were recording continuous interior temperatures across homestead cabins on the night of January 12, 1888. What we have are accounts, written, oral, and reconstructed, that describe conditions in terms vivid enough to allow reasonable estimation. What follows is a plausible reconstruction, built from period accounts, comparative building physics, and the documented properties of the materials involved. In a typical one-room frame cabin of the period, board walls, minimal insulation, wood-burning stove, the night of the blizzard would have unfolded as a sustained thermal crisis. With outdoor temperatures dropping to between -10 and -20 degrees Fahrenheit in many parts of the region and winds sustaining above 40 miles per hour, the effective wind chill on exterior wall surfaces was catastrophic. Heat loss through those walls would have increased by 50 to 70% above calm air rates. A family burning fuel continuously, at the upper limit of what their stove could handle, might have held interior temperatures somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst hours of the night. Those who ran short of fuel, or whose stoves were overwhelmed by backdraft from the wind, reported interior temperatures falling to within 10 to 15 degrees of the exterior, conditions that, in a weakened or elderly person, represented genuine danger of hypothermia. In a well-built sod dye, without major structural failure, conditions were somewhat better. The greater thermal mass of the sod walls provided more buffering against rapid heat loss, and a functioning stove could typically hold the interior above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even in severe conditions, assuming the roof held and the fuel lasted. But the sod surface exposure to wind still permitted meaningful convective heat loss, and by the early hours of the morning, even robust sod structures were reportedly struggling to stay meaningfully above freezing in the worst affected areas. In the Brandt dugout, the thermometer, a simple mercury instrument mounted on the interior rear wall, away from both the stove and the entrance, read 62 degrees Fahrenheit when the family went to sleep, roughly 4 hours after the storm's arrival. By morning, with the stove burned down to coals and the storm still howling above, it read 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That 8-degree overnight drop, in the middle of the most violent blizzard the region had experienced in 65 years, represents something worth pausing on. It means the dugout lost less than half a degree of interior temperature per hour, in conditions where surface structures were losing 3 to 5 degrees per hour. It means the earth surrounding the structure had absorbed the full violence of the storm without passing it inward. It means the family inside actually slept, while their neighbors were feeding fires in desperation or huddling under everything they owned. The comparison points are stark. Against a frame cabin that might have read 35 degrees Fahrenheit by morning with continuous burning, the dugout's 54 degrees Fahrenheit represents a difference of nearly 20 degrees under equivalent conditions. Against a poorly constructed sod die that had fallen to near freezing, the gap widens further. The food stores in the dugout's rear alcove stayed between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the event, cold enough to preserve, warm enough to prevent freezing damage to root vegetables, preserved meat, and the family's seed stock for spring planting. In several neighboring homesteads, food stores froze solid during the blizzard, destroying supplies that could not be replaced until the next growing season. There is one further number worth recording. In the days following the blizzard, as the community assessed its damage and accounted for its losses, a neighbor who had spent years referring to the Brandt dugout as an embarrassment walked across the frozen prairie to the hillside entrance. He stood there for a moment, looking at the untroubled mound of earth with its thin column of chimney, smoke rising straight up into the cold, clear air. He knocked. Brandt opened the door. The neighbor looked past him into the warm interior, the dry walls, the steady stove, the family at the table, and said nothing for a long moment. Whatever he said next, the historical record does not preserve. But local oral accounts suggest he visited 2 more times that winter before spring arrived, each time staying longer than the last. Some lessons don't need words. The days after a great blizzard on the frontier carried a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of assessment, of walking through snow-altered landscape and adding up what had been lost, what had held, and what that difference meant going forward. In the week following January 12, 1888, that accounting was brutal across wide stretches of Nebraska and Dakota Territory. Livestock losses were staggering. Cattle and horses that had been outside or in failing shelters froze in place, and a spring thaw would reveal the scale of the damage in full. Crop stores were ruined in dozens of homesteads. Several families had to abandon claims they had spent years building, returning east with nothing because the combination of structural failure and lost supplies had made continuing impossible. The human losses were quieter on the individual claim level, but no less devastating. Families who had survived the night in near-freezing interiors emerged with frostbitten extremities, illness, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting cold for 12 continuous hours without rest. Children who had been in school when the storm hit became the defining tragedy of the event. The accounts of teachers and students caught in those thin-walled rural schoolhouses, some making desperate runs for shelter that ended badly, gave the blizzard its lasting name. Against this backdrop, the condition of the Brandt homestead was not just a curiosity. It was a provocation. Word traveled the way word always traveled on the plains, slowly at first, then faster as the same observation was confirmed by multiple sets of eyes. The Norwegians' dugout had come through without damage. No collapsed roof, No frozen stores. No desperate burning of furniture in the final hours of the night. The family had slept. The stove had burned at a normal rate. The interior had dropped less than 10 degrees over 18 hours of the worst storm in living memory. Neighbors who had spent years dismissing the structure as an eccentricity were now approaching it with a different posture. Some came under the pretext of checking on the family, a natural enough gesture in the aftermath of a disaster. Others were more direct, asking specific questions about construction and asking to see the interior. Brandt, characteristically, welcomed everyone without ceremony, answered what was asked, and offered no version of "I told you so" that any surviving account records. What struck visitors most consistently, according to reconstructed oral account from the period, was not the temperature differential, though that was remarkable enough. It was the state of the food stores. In the rear alcove of the dugout, where Brandt had dug an additional 18 inches into the hillside to create a naturally cooler storage niche, the family's winter provisions were entirely intact. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, potatoes showed no freeze damage. A crock of preserved meat was undisturbed. The seed corn for spring planting, which Brandt had wrapped in burlap and stored in the alcove's lowest shelf, was dry, viable, and waiting. In several neighboring homesteads, the equivalent stores had been destroyed. Potatoes frozen solid and then thawed became inedible mush. Seed stocks that had been kept in frame cabin corners or unheated outbuildings were compromised. The practical consequences would extend well past the winter. Damaged seed corn meant reduced planting in spring, which meant reduced harvest in fall, which meant another winter entered with inadequate reserves. The cascade from a single night's structural failure could reach 2 or 3 years into the future. The reckoning, then, was not only about the storm. It was about what the storm had revealed, that some structures on the plains were genuinely adequate to the environment, and some were not, and that the line between those categories did not run along the boundary between expensive and cheap or modern and primitive. It ran along something harder to quantify, the line between building what seemed appropriate and building what the land and the physics actually required. Brandt's dugout had not survived by luck. It had survived by design. And by the spring of 1888, enough people in Custer County had accepted that fact to change, in small but measurable ways, how the next season's building decisions were made. Edvard Brandt was not the first person to understand what the earth beneath the Nebraska plains was offering. He was, in many respects, the inheritor of a knowledge tradition that was far older, far broader, and far more sophisticated than the frontier mythology of the rugged individual inventor would suggest. Earth-shelter dwelling is not a frontier invention. It is one of the oldest recurring solutions in human architectural history, found independently, across millennia, wherever climate extremes made above-ground construction inadequate and where the thermal properties of the earth were available to be used. The Norse longhouses of Scandinavia incorporated earthen berms against their walls not as decoration, but as insulation and wind protection. The sod-covered farmhouses of Iceland, the turf houses, were built partially into hillsides using techniques that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had seen Brandt's construction. Peoples of the North American Arctic had developed the sodden whalebone structures known as karmate, winter dwellings that used the same earth-coupling principle to survive conditions that would have destroyed any above-ground wooden structure within hours. On the Great Plains, the knowledge had arrived through several distinct channels, often simultaneously, as the wave of immigration from the 1860s through the 1880s brought settlers from radically different building traditions into the same flat, treeless landscape. German-Russian immigrants, descendants of communities that had settled the Russian steppes under Catherine the Great's invitation in the 18th century and lived there for generations before emigrating to America, brought specific knowledge of earthen construction appropriate to treeless, windswept plains environments. The steppe winters of southern Russia were not entirely unlike Nebraska winters, and the building solutions those communities had developed over a century of prairie living traveled with them across the Atlantic. Scandinavian settlers, like Brandt, brought the northern European tradition of building with and into the earth, a tradition shaped by centuries of dealing with extreme cold, limited timber in many regions, and the practical experience of watching earthen structures outlast wooden ones in harsh climates. And underneath all of it, predating all of it by centuries, were the building traditions of the indigenous peoples of the plains themselves. The earth lodge, used by the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Pawnee peoples among others, represented perhaps the most fully developed earth-sheltered dwelling tradition on the continent. These were not simple dugouts. They were sophisticated circular structures, partially submerged, with heavy timber and earthen roofs, central hearths, and entrance tunnels designed to function as cold traps. The same vestibule principle that Brandt had incorporated into his dugouts design. Oral histories and early ethnographic accounts describe earth lodges maintaining interior temperatures of 50 degrees Fahrenheit or above through the coldest plains winters, with a fraction of the fuel consumption of a comparable above-ground structure. The knowledge was there. It had always been there. What the 1870s and 1880s homestead wave did, in many cases, was import a set of building assumptions from forested, moderate climate environments in the American East and Europe and apply them wholesale to a landscape those assumptions were not designed for. Frame cabins made sense in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where timber was abundant and winters were cold but rarely savage. On the treeless, wind-savage Central Plains, they were a category error, a solution borrowed from the wrong problem. What Brandt and the settlers who built well understood was that the plains required a different relationship with the land. Not conquest, not imposition of an imported template. A negotiation in which the builder offered labor and intent, and the earth offered thermal stability, wind protection, and material in return. That negotiation produced dugouts, earth lodges, and a handful of partially bermed sod structures that outperformed everything around them in the critical test that the Great Plains winter applied. It produced knowledge that should have been codified, taught, and carried forward into the construction culture of the region. Instead, by the turn of the 20th century, it was largely abandoned. The story of how earth-sheltered construction disappeared from the Great Plains, and from mainstream American building practice more broadly, is a story about the seductive logic of abundance. And it is a story with a deeply uncomfortable ending, because the abundance it depended on is no longer unconditional, and the consequences of ignoring what the earth offers are becoming harder to dismiss. By the 1890s and into the early 1900s, the economics of frontier building were changing. The expansion of the railroad network made milled lumber genuinely accessible to plains homesteaders for the first time. Factory-produced stoves, cast-iron hardware, and glass windows became affordable commodities rather than rare luxuries. The practical constraints that had made earth-sheltered building an attractive option, the scarcity of timber, the difficulty of importing materials, the hard-won recognition that above-ground construction could not reliably survive extreme plains winters, were easing. And with the easing of constraint came the easing of necessity. Why dig into a hillside when you could order lumber by rail and build something that looked like a proper house? Why learn the drainage geometry of a dugout entrance when you could nail boards together and be done in a week? The dugout, the sod dye, the earth lodge, these were associated in the cultural imagination with poverty, with the desperate early years of settlement, with the period before civilization had properly arrived. As prosperity increased, the impulse was to leave those associations behind, to build up, not down, to signal arrival rather than survival. What was lost in that transition was not merely aesthetic. It was functional. The frame houses that replaced the dugouts and sod structures of the plains were, in thermal terms, significantly inferior to what they displaced, despite being more expensive, more time-consuming to build, and more dependent on continuous fuel supply to remain habitable. A well-built dugout with earthen berming and a modest stove could maintain livable interior temperatures through a serious blizzard with a fraction of the fuel consumption of a frame house. The frame house, for all its visual appeal and social legibility, was a step backward in thermal efficiency. That step backward became invisible because energy got cheap. Coal, and later oil and natural gas, made it possible to heat an inefficient structure at a cost that seemed acceptable until it didn't. The energy crises of the 1970s produced the first modern wave of interest in earth shelter construction, and a genuine body of research and practice emerged during that decade. Architects and engineers began documenting what builders like Brandt had understood intuitively: that a structure coupled to the Earth's stable ground temperature could reduce heating and cooling loads by 50 to 80% compared to an equivalent above-ground structure in the same climate zone. The vocabulary changed. Dugout became earth-sheltered home. Sod dye became rammed earth construction. The principles remained identical. Today, the passive house movement, the earth-ship building tradition, and the growing body of earth-sheltered residential construction represent a formal, engineered rediscovery of the same physics that Edvard Brandt applied in Nebraska hillside in 1879. Passive house standards, which use careful building orientation, massive insulated envelopes, and thermal mass to minimize heating and cooling demand, routinely achieve 75 to 90% reductions in energy use compared to conventional frame construction. Earth-sheltered homes built to modern standards in the central United States consistently report annual heating costs that would have seemed impossible to a homeowner in a conventionally built house. The irony is almost too clean to accept. The construction techniques that were abandoned as primitive and embarrassing in the 1890s are now being patented, certified, awarded, and celebrated as innovative and cutting-edge in the 2020s. The physics did not change. The climate did not become more forgiving. What changed was the price of ignoring what the Earth was offering. And that price is now, once again, visible enough to pay attention to. The neighbor who laughed at Brandt's dugout built a frame house instead. His grandchildren heat it with natural gas. The bill arrives every month. And every winter, when the temperature drops hard and fast across the plains, the meter spins a little faster, doing with machinery and fossil fuel what the earth under that Nebraska hillside did for free for 40 years. There's a way of building that works with the world. And there's a way of building that works against it and wins for a while until the cost of winning becomes too high to sustain. Edvard Brandt's dugout was not an act of genius. It was not a revolutionary invention or a radical departure from established knowledge. It was the application of principles that have been understood, practiced, and proven across multiple cultures and centuries, applied carefully, patiently, and precisely to a specific landscape by a man who had taken time to understand what that landscape was actually like before deciding how to respond to it. That is the lesson, and it is simpler and more challenging than it first appears. The simplest version is thermal. Ground-coupled structures use the Earth's constant temperature as a baseline, eliminate convective heat loss through surface exposure, and require dramatically less fuel to maintain comfortable interior conditions than equivalent above-ground construction. The numbers are real. The physics are settled. A dugout properly sited and properly built is a more efficient heating system than a frame cabin in the same climate. Not marginally more efficient, but fundamentally more efficient in ways that compound over every cold night of every winter for as long as the structure stands. But there is a deeper version of the lesson, and it is the one that Brandt's story keeps returning to, regardless of which angle you approach it from. The deeper version is about the relationship between builder and environment. Brandt did not arrive on the Nebraska plains with a plan. He arrived with a set of principles, inherited, learned, tested in a different but climatically related context, and he applied those principles to what the land in front of him was actually offering. He walked the property. He dug test holes. He measured what the earth was doing at depth before he decided what he was going to ask of it. He oriented his entrance to take advantage of winter sun and natural wind shelter. He positioned his stove where the convective circulation of the space would distribute its heat most efficiently. He designed his roof to take snow load rather than shed it, understanding that the packed snow above him was not a threat but an additional insulating layer. Every one of those decisions was a form of listening, and every one of them paid dividends that his neighbors, who had imported their building assumptions wholesale from elsewhere and never stopped to ask what the land itself had to say, did not collect. The winter of 1888 was the examination. It was not the last hard winter the plains would see. And it was not the last time a well-built earth-sheltered structure would outperform its above-ground neighbors in the critical moment. But it was the moment when the difference between building with an environment and building against it became impossible for those who were paying attention to dismiss. 40 years after Brandt broke ground on that Nebraska hillside, the dugout was still standing. The frame cabins of several of his original critics had been replaced once or twice over. The sod-dye that collapsed in the blizzard of 1888 had been rebuilt, damaged again, and eventually abandoned. The earth that Brandt had built into, slowly, carefully, with full attention to what it was offering, had not moved. What he understood, and what the long history of vernacular earth-shelter construction confirms, is that the land is not a problem to be solved. It is a partner to be understood. And the builders who took the time to understand it, the Norse farmers, the Icelandic turf house builders, the Mandan Earth Lodge engineers, the German-Russian steppe settlers, the Norwegian immigrant on a Nebraska hillside, built things that lasted, that worked, and that did not require the burning of the world to stay warm. That is not a primitive idea. It never was. It is, in fact, the most sophisticated idea in the history of building. And it is as available today as it was in 1879, waiting, as it always has been, just a few feet below the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to dig. Note, this script is intended for historical and educational purposes only. It does not substitute for professional engineering or construction advice.